The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Appendix 1, Magic Explanation, up until Volume 3. This is an explanation of the no attribute magic and death attribute magic used by the protagonist. Different spells require different amounts of technical skill and mana. When the protagonist lacks the technical skill for a certain spell, he makes up for it by expending a large amount of mana to cast the spell forcibly. Also, as each type of magic levels up in skill, the strength and effects of their spells increase. No attribute magic. This is magic cast using mana that has not been influenced by any attribute and does not exist in origin. Because it uses mana that has not been influenced by any attribute, anyone can use it no matter what attribute he or she has an affinity for. Thus, it is convenient for both those teaching the fundamentals of magic as well as those learning them, so apprentice mages begin learning the sensation of using and controlling mana with this type of magic. Because no attribute mana is not influenced by any attribute, it quickly disperses once it leaves the body. Because it is difficult to maintain, only has simple effects, and using magic with an attribute produces more efficient and effective spells, the people of Lambda consider it little more than a tool to train with. It is common for first-rate mages with level 5 in magic with an attribute to have a level 1 skill in no attribute magic. However, there are also a few who do not fail to perform fundamental training in no attribute magic. Telekinesis. Skill requirement. Minimal to great, depending on the object being moved, speed and distance of movement. Mana requirement, as above. A spell that moves an object with mana. It is similar to psychokinesis. Anything from a pebble to a boulder can be moved as long as it is a physical object. As long as the caster has enough mana, he can freely control the distance and speed of the movement. However, the average mage would likely run out of mana and collapse just from moving a human-sized boulder a single meter. It can also be used on objects that are moving, but this requires a high level in the mana control skill. Flight. Skill requirement, if ignoring safety, low. Mana requirement, a small to medium amount per second, depending on the caster's body weight. With higher speeds and complicated flight patterns, the required amount of mana increases rapidly. An application of telekinesis. As telekinesis is used to lift up and move the caster's own body, it is a fundamentally dangerous spell. Failing to control it properly would result in the caster killing himself. If the caster loses concentration, it is common that he crashes headfirst into the ground. Appraisal. Skill requirement, low. Mana requirement, low. The promised all-purpose skill of Isekai works is not this one. The appraisal skill of Lambda is a spell that produces information regarding the target by drawing conclusions from information already known by the caster. So, when the caster uses appraisal on an unknown target, it simply makes conjectures from the caster's own knowledge. For example, if appraisal is used on a mushroom and the caster is not knowledgeable about mushrooms, he would only see something like a mysterious mushroom. It is a mushroom, classified as fungus. If the caster is an expert on mushrooms, he would be able to use similar mushroom species as a reference to make conjectures as to whether the target mushroom is poisonous or not, how it tastes, and how it grows. However, that does not mean that the resulting information is necessarily correct. Because it displays information that has entered the caster's mind once, even if the caster has already forgotten about it, there are many who use this spell as a convenient way of having an internal encyclopedia. Most guilds have measures to prevent cheating in exams through the use of this spell. However, if one can cast this spell in such a way that the examiners would not notice it, this would demonstrate excellence in another way, since, at the very least, this would mean that the caster possesses the chant revocation skill. Of course, this spell does not allow the caster to see the status of others, though things like slaves or familiars owned by the caster are an exception to this. Vandalu's followers are an exception to that rule as well. Mana transfer. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that transfers mana to a target that is in contact with the caster. However, the ratio of mana transferred is, on average, around 50% of the mana spent. This ratio changes depending on the caster's compatibility with the target. There are cases where twins can transfer with over 100% efficiency, as well as negative efficiency ratios for those who have poor relationships with each other. This compatibility is not something that people are born with. It can change based on the mental states of the caster and the target. Because of this, there was a period of time where mages used genders to determine compatibilities. Mana bullet. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low to great. An offensive spell that compresses no attribute mana into a sphere and fires it. But because its firing distance is short and its projectile speed is slow, it is almost never used in real battles. It is only used as a last resort in cases where the enemy has a high resistance for the caster's specialty attribute. Its normal power is around the level of a solid straight punch. Because the protagonist puts 10,000 mana into a single projectile, it has a considerable firing range and has enough power to turn a rank 3 monster, around the strength of a brown bear, into a mass of dead meat. However, because its projectile speed is slow and its trajectory is predictable, some kind of trick is needed to make the projectile hit. Healing power enhancement. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement medium to great. A spell that enhances the caster's own healing power with mana. However, it is less efficient than spells with an attribute that has the same effect, so this spell normally does little more than provide temporary treatment. But as the protagonist possesses a large amount of mana, medical knowledge gained on Earth and in Origin, such as information regarding the body's structure, and his rapid regeneration skill, this spell produces a sufficient healing effect. In addition, if spirit form transformation is used at the same time, he can fuse parts of his body with another person's, allowing him to use this spell to heal the wounds of others. Physical ability enhancement. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low to great. A spell that enhances the caster's physical ability. It is mainly used for muscular power, but it is remarkably less effective than enhancement spells with an attribute. Vandalu can cast this spell, but there aren't really any cases where he has to use it. If he uses it carelessly, his body will become unable to withstand the vast amount of mana, causing his muscles to burst and his bones to break. Death attribute magic. Magic that can only be learned by those who inherently have no affinity for any attribute of magic. It might be more appropriate to say that such people are born without an affinity for any other attribute. It cannot be gained by those who have no inherent affinity for any attribute due to a curse. It is an attribute for which nobody in either Origin or Lambda possesses other than Vandalu, and there are no past examples either. However, it is apparently particularly similar to the special abilities wielded by the Demon King Gududanis. Danger Sense Death. Skill requirement minimal. Mana requirement minimal. A spell that allows the detection of danger for the caster and those near the caster. This spell not only detects malice, ill will, and killing intent toward the caster, it also detects danger, such as poison in the caster's cups or bombs planted near the caster. The spell also reacts to indirect danger, such as the risk of a stray bullet from a professional hitman who is aiming for the person walking in front of the caster. As it detects sources of dangers no matter how far away they are, it is a useful spell. However, it does not react to dangers that do not lead to death. If there was a young prankster sneaking up on the caster with intent to throw a cream pie on his head, this spell would not react. And as for the function of detecting death for those other than the caster, it does not function perfectly unless they are near the caster. Sterilization. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that kills bacteria, viruses, and fungi within a target space. The area of effect can be increased by using more mana to cast the spell. It can also be used to target a certain type of microorganism, such as sterilizing only the influenza viruses in a sake brewery without affecting the koji. It is also possible to target microorganisms in corpses and such, but microorganisms inside the bodies of living creatures cannot be targeted. If the caster is able to somehow fuse with that organism or directly examine inside of its body, then it does become possible. Also, this spell does not function sufficiently to kill fungi and mold that have become monsters. It merely weakens their functions. Bug Killer. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell with sterilization's effects limited to bugs. It kills creatures that the caster recognizes as bugs. Vandaloo considers pillbugs and woodlice to be crustaceans, so he cannot kill them. Like sterilization, this spell is unable to kill bugs inside of living creatures. For it to work, the caster must use a method to either directly examine the inside of the body or fuse with the creature itself. However, it can kill bugs visible from outside the body, such as parasites in the mucous membranes of the eyeball. Also, like sterilization, this spell is ineffective against bugs that have turned into monsters. However, it does cause them discomfort, so it can ward them off. Undead Transformation. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement high. A spell that makes spirits possess corpses and inanimate objects to turn them into undead-type monsters. The type of monster created depends on the condition of the spirit, the object they are possessing, and the amount of mana used in the spell. There is no guarantee that the resulting undead will be obedient to the caster, but those created by Vandaloo obey him due to the effects of the death attribute charm. Golem Transmutation. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement high. A spell that makes spirits possess inanimate objects to turn them into golem-type monsters. As they are actually undead that possess inorganic bodies instead of corpses, anti-undead light attribute spells are effective on them. In addition, the changing of the golem's shapes comes from the golem transmutation skill, so the shapes of the golems cannot be manipulated with this spell alone. Demon Fire. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that produces a blue-white flame that absorbs heat from its surroundings. It can be made to float in the air to provide illumination. Additionally, it can be used for cooling objects down. Touching it will not cause frostbite immediately, but it is about as cold as a household freezer, so touching it for long periods of time would be dangerous. Nothing is actually burning, so it is not extinguished if water is poured over it or it is submerged. Heat Leech. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that leeches heat energy from its target. It can be used for things like extinguishing fires. It cannot directly leach heat from living things. The leached heat energy simply disappears, so it is impossible to use that energy for something else. Bloodshed Enhancement. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. An enhancement spell that can be cast on weapons and bodies, increasing attack power against living things, things with vitality displayed in their status. As it is specialized for fighting organisms, it does not produce any effects against corpses or inanimate obstacles. Energy absorption. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. An enhancement spell that absorbs attack power external to the enchanted object. Kinetic, heat, electrical, mana, it absorbs any kind of energy. Because of this, it enhances defenses against both physical and magical attacks. However, it is powerless against poison and any disease that is not accompanied by mana. In addition, it also absorbs light energy, so it has the weakness of causing blindness if cast on the eyeballs. But this weakness is not a problem for those with the dark vision skill. Disinfect and detoxification. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement depends on the strength of the poison. Spells that neutralize the toxicity of a substance. These spells differ from an antidote because it targets the poison itself, allowing it to neutralize the poison before it enters the body of a living creature. Disinfect can only target inanimate objects. With this spell, cooked onions are harmless for a dog, honey is harmless for a baby, and deadly poison coating an assassin's blade is harmless to living people. In contrast, detoxification can also target living creatures. It can neutralize the toxins secreted by living pufferfish, venomous snakes, and microorganisms that cause illness. However, it does not stop the venom production of creatures like pufferfish or snakes, so if they are left alone long enough, they create more venom and return to normal. Deodorization. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement depends on the strength of the poison. A spell that neutralizes odor within a target area of effect. It can neutralize any odor, no matter how unpleasant it is, but any new odors released in the target area after the spell is cast can be smelled as normal. This includes examples such as fresh sweat being produced and decomposition continuing after the spell is cast. Detect life. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that detects life within a certain area. It reacts weakly to undead and artificial organisms such as golems, and it is completely unable to detect objects that do not have vitality displayed in their status. Preservation. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement depends on the size of the target. A spell that preserves the freshness of its target. It prevents the oxidation, desiccation, and decomposition of its target. Items with this spell cast on them can be dried in the sun while maintaining the freshness of their organic components. However, these items do not become indestructible, so it is still possible to burn items with this spell cast on them using fire. Also, living creatures cannot be targeted by this spell, so it does not prevent aging. It does prevent hair from becoming disheveled, however. Freshness restoration. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement depends on the state of freshness that is being restored. A spell that restores the freshness of a target. It restores decomposed organic substances to their original state, but it does not restore damage caused by decomposition. Also, if this spell is used on a mummy, it has no effect unless water is applied at the same time. If this is used on fermented food, it reverses the fermentation process. Decomposition and fermentation. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement depends on the degree of decomposition and fermentation. Spells that decompose or ferment their target. On Earth and in Origin, there are no strict differences between the phenomenon of decomposition and fermentation, other than that fermentation is useful to humans, so, strictly speaking, these two are essentially the same spell. The difference is that decomposition has no limits to the time, duration, and effect of the decomposition it causes to its target, while fermentation limits the duration of the effects to a point where it results in something that is useful to humans. If decomposition is used on a barrel of fresh miso, unless the duration is limited, even the barrel itself will decompose and disintegrate, never mind the soya beans. But no matter how long fermentation is cast on the same barrel of fresh miso, the resulting product will be fermented miso. Because of this, the use of fermentation is limited to things like creating fermented foods from fresh ingredients and compost from waste. However, if used on ingredients for sake, the environment must be adjusted accordingly and its limits must be placed, otherwise vinegar will be produced. Also, decomposition has no effect on living creatures and inanimate objects that do not decompose. Maturation. Skill requirement low, mana requirement low. The fermentation spell with further limitations. It is a spell that allows meat, fish, fruit, and vegetables to ripen without rotting. Aging and inanimate aging. Skill requirement low, mana requirement medium. Spells that cause drastic aging to their target. However, its effects only last as long as the spell is being used, and only the body part in contact with the caster is designated as the target. The caster can cause aging in the whole of a target's skin by touching one part of the skin, but it is impossible to cause aging in bones or the brain. The only difference between aging and inanimate aging is whether the target is living or not. Also, aging does not cause growth, so using it on a child would simply cause the child to age while maintaining a child's constitution. Inanimate aging has uses such as making dried kombu. Spirit form transformation. Skill requirement low, mana requirement medium. A spell that turns the caster's flesh into spirit form. It is possible to select which parts are turned into spirit form, so the caster can use it on his whole body or just his arms. The transformed parts become semi-transparent, but they remain visible to the naked eye even to those without specialized jobs such as spiritualist. Body parts under the effect of this spell are unaffected by physical forces and can pass through physical objects. In order to harm body parts under the effect of this spell, either martial skills or magic must be cast, or weapons made of silver or magical metals such as mithril must be used. Also, because changing the shape of the spirit form is fundamentally manipulating the original part, willingly breaking down the original shape, for example, turning arms into tentacles and branching them out or splitting heads, carries the risk of causing mental damage, memory loss, or madness. This problem does not apply to those who have already had the above damage dealt to them. Youth transformation. Skill requirement high. Mana requirement high. A spell that absorbs the aging of the target, causing a reversal of aging. Only the parts in contact with the caster are designated as targets, so in order to reverse aging in the entire body, the caster must be in contact with not only the target's skin, but also the bones, organs, and nerves. If age is continuously reversed in the organs and nerves, one would be theoretically immortal, becoming able to live hundreds or thousands of years. However, this spell does not reverse time, so it does not cause memory loss or the reverting of the target's personality to that of a child. There are cases where it improves the target's ability to remember things, causing them to remember things of the past that they had forgotten, and growing due to the age reversal in the bones and cartilage. Poison, deadly poison, and industrial poison. Skill requirement low to high. Mana requirement low to high. Spells that create poison. They can create poisonous compounds at the fingertips or apply deadly poison to objects in contact with the caster. Though they have different names, the only difference between them is the degree of toxicity of the poisons they produce. The difficulty of casting the spells and the amount of mana required depend on the toxicity and complexity of the poison's effects. Also, only poisonous substances known to the caster can be created. Vandaloo uses his scientific knowledge from Earth and his experiences in Origin to create them. These skills can also be used to create monster toxins that can be used to create medicine, as well as things like anesthetics, sleeping drugs, muscle relaxants, and muscle strengthening drugs. Disease, deadly disease, and industrial disease. Skill requirement low to high, mana requirement low to high. These spells create bacteria and viruses that cause disease. It generates microorganisms at the fingertips and on objects in contact with the caster. The difficulty in casting the spells and the amount of mana required depends on the disease's infectious capacity, targets, mortality rate, and symptoms. These factors cannot all be controlled freely. Trial and error research is required, unless creating a known pathogen. Also, accurate medical knowledge is required. Vandaloo gained knowledge in Origin, where science is more advanced than on Earth, and was infected with many different fatal diseases, so he is able to produce new diseases even without a specialized experimental facility. Lemure creation. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement medium. This spell creates familiars with the appearance of mostly transparent skulls. They can fly, and as they do not physically exist, they move silently unless the materialization spell is used. The caster can borrow their vision and other senses and issue orders to them even from afar. Also, lemures can be given an order to self-destruct. When they obey this order, they release a powerful killing intent that triggers the target's survival instincts. They have less self-awareness than familiars created through other attributes of magic, so they are almost completely unable to make their own decisions. Incidentally, the spell used to create familiars of other attributes of magic is named Familiar Creation. The reason this spell's name is different is because Vandaloo is unable to make any familiars other than lemures. Magic Absorption Barrier. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement small to great. A spell that creates a black fog-like barrier that absorbs mana. When the caster is surrounded by this barrier, no one other than the caster is able to release mana outside of his body. Also, if the caster surrounds his own body with this barrier, it renders magical attacks completely ineffective. Its weakness is that it does not block physical objects at all, and the barrier can be escaped by moving faster than the fog can keep up with. For example, if a rock is thrown at the barrier with telekinesis, the barrier will cancel telekinesis but not stop the rock that has already been thrown. This barrier is also unable to stop martial skills that work through passing mana through the inside of the body or a weapon. The amount of mana that can be absorbed by the barrier is proportional to the amount of mana the caster used to create it. Impact Negating Barrier. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement small to great. A spell that creates a barrier that absorbs every kind of energy, including kinetic energy, other than mana. This spell is cast with the caster at its center. None other than the caster can move inside it freely. It is a physical version of the mana absorption barrier, but since it cannot be cast on targets other than the caster himself, it is a defense-specialized spell. However, splitting the caster's arms from his main body, controlling them with long-distance control, and casting the barrier around the arms is possible. Withering. Skill requirement, medium. Mana requirement, medium. A spell that causes damage by evaporating the water content in a target. Whether this damage is fatal or not depends on the target's vitality, magical defense, biology, and whether it can recover its water content immediately or not. However, the attack power of this spell is low. A high skill level and thousands of mana are required to perform feats like instantly mummifying a person. The vitality loss caused by this spell cannot be recovered through natural healing measures. Water content must be replenished. Though the spell's effects are decreased when used on already dead bodies, it can be used on inorganic substances. It can be used to instantly turn fresh fish into dried fish or dry up muddy roads. Corpse healing. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement depends on the damage being healed. A healing spell for undead and corpses. Missing parts can be replaced with substitute parts. It is impossible to resurrect the dead with this spell, and if there are too many damaged parts, this spell cannot repair them. Also, there are some species that cannot be repaired, for example, the heads of the headless knights. Healing negation. Skill requirement high. Mana requirement medium to great. A spell that negates vitality-restoring effects of things such as the target's natural healing ability, regeneration-type skills, spells, and items. This spell cannot be cast unless the target is nearby. The stronger the healing power of the method that the target is trying to use to heal is, the more mana is required. However, casting this spell on targets that have already sustained a wound often results in death due to blood loss. But as the targets must be nearby, within 2 meters, it is not a very practical spell. Visualization. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement low. A spell developed by Vandaloo after being reincarnated in Lambda. It allows spirits that are normally invisible and inaudible to be seen and heard by others. However, the spirits still cannot be touched. Materialization. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement high. A spell developed by Vandaloo after being reincarnated in Lambda. It allows materialization of spirits by pouring mana into them. However, they are still spirits, so they don't eat and the vitality on their status is still 0. Physical attacks are also still ineffective. Spirits cannot use skills and such from when they were alive. Also, their mana falls a little short of the average person. In addition, this spell can be used to materialize ghosts and evil spirits that do not normally have physical forms. The spell can also be used to create an incarnation of familiar spirits, heroic spirits, and even gods if the target is willing. However, as the required amount of mana goes from several thousand to several hundred million to do so, it is not realistic for anyone other than Vandaloo. Incidentally, the materialization skill is something that can only be used on the owner of the skill. It is something separate from this spell. Erase presence. Skill requirement low. Mana requirement low. A spell that Vandaloo is constantly using unconsciously. It erases the presence of a target. It erases things like bloodthirst, animosity, and heroic presence. It makes the target's presence completely imperceptible. Those casting this skill will likely appear as dreams or ghosts that can be seen during the day. But as Vandaloo's death attribute charm overcomes the effects of this spell, he is noticed by those affected by death attribute charm. Death bullet. Skill requirement medium. Mana requirement high. Death attribute projectiles that take the vitality from their target. They appear to be black, fingertip-sized spheres, so they do not look very powerful. However, they directly rob the vitality of those they come in contact with, even through armor and shields. As one of the death attribute's few offensive spells, this spell has excellent projectile speed and firing distance.